The sun had barely crested the horizon on October 15th, 1991, when Malcolm Hendry made the discovery that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Malcolm, a 52-year-old accountant with a paunch and thinning hair, had been jogging along Narrabeen Beach for nearly 15 years, 5 mornings a week without fail. His doctor had prescribed the exercise after a mild heart scare in 1989, and Malcolm had taken to it with the dedication he applied to his spreadsheets. This particular Tuesday morning was cooler than usual for October in Sydney, with a stiff breeze coming off the Tasman Sea that made his eyes water as he ran along the packed sand near the waterline. Malcolm had just rounded the northern end of the beach, near the rocky outcrop that separated Narrabeen from the smaller Coleroy beach, when he noticed something unusual. At first, he thought it was driftwood or perhaps a dead seal, something large and dark, partially covered by sand near the base of the dunes. The tide had been high during the night and was now receding, leaving behind the usual debris of seaweed, broken shells, and plastic bottles. But as Malcolm slowed his pace and approached, his stomach lurched with a sickening realization. What protruded from the sand was unmistakably a human hand, pale and rigid, fingers slightly curled as if reaching for something just out of grasp. Malcolm stumbled backward. His legs suddenly weak and fell onto the sand. His breath came in gasps that had nothing to do with his morning run. For a moment he couldn't move, couldn't think. Then training and instinct took over. He scrambled to his feet and ran toward the surf club building where he knew there would be a phone. His hands shook so badly that he could barely dial 000. The operator's calm voice asked him to repeat himself twice before understanding what he was saying. A body. There was a body on Narrabeen Beach. No, he hadn't touched it. Yes, he was certain it was human. Please, send someone quickly. Within 20 minutes, the beach was cordoned off with yellow police tape that flapped violently in the morning wind. Senior Constable Raymond Birchall arrived in an unmarked sedan, accompanied by Constable Gillian Moresby and a team from the Forensic Services Division. Birchall was 42 years old, with steel-grey hair cropped close to his skull and a face that had seen too many crime scenes over his 20-year career. He had a reputation for thoroughness that bordered on obsession, and his colleagues either respected him deeply or found him insufferably meticulous. There was no middle ground with Raymond Birchall. The body was that of a woman, as the initial officers on scene had already determined. She lay face down, partially buried in the sand about 30 meters from the waterline. The tide had clearly moved her position during the night, covering her lower body while leaving her upper torso and one arm exposed. Birchall knelt beside the body, careful not to disturb the sand patterns around it, and studied what was visible. The woman appeared to be in her 30s, with dark brown hair matted with sand and seawater. She wore jeans and a light blue jumper, both soaked through and covered in sand. One foot was bare, the other still wearing a white canvas shoe. Birchall noted the pale skin, the way her fingers were bent, the slight discoloration around what he could see of her neck. His gut told him this was no accidental drowning. Chapter 1. The Victim's Life. The woman's name was Fiona Marjorie Westbrook, and she had lived what most people would describe as an ordinary life, neither remarkable nor tragic until the moment it ended on that cold October night. 34 years old, Fiona had worked as a pharmacy technician at DY Discount Chemist for the past 7 years, a job that paid modestly but steadily. She lived alone in a small one-bedroom flat on Oaks Avenue, a narrow street lined with weatherboard houses and small apartment blocks that housed the working-class residents of the Northern Beaches suburb. Her flat was on the second floor of a 1960s-era building with peeling white paint and a shared laundry in the basement that smelled perpetually of mildew and detergent. Those who knew Fiona described her as quiet but friendly, the sort of person who would chat pleasantly while counting out pills or processing prescriptions, but never revealed much about her personal life. Her co-worker, Estelle Drummond, told police that Fiona kept to herself mostly, eating her lunch alone in the back room while reading romance novels from the paperback rack they kept near the front counter. She never spoke, Estelle corrected herself, her eyes filling with tears, much about her private affairs, but she was always kind, always helpful to the customers. especially the elderly ones who came in with their long lists of medications and confusion about what to take when. Fiona had been married once, to Trevor Westbrook, a mechanic who ran his own small garage in Brookvale. They had met in 1982 at a party thrown by mutual friends, married within a year in a modest ceremony at Manly Registry Office, and divorced just as quietly in 1989. The marriage had produced no children, which was something Fiona had apparently regretted, according to her mother Beverly. The divorce had been bitter, though the details remained murky. Trevor claimed that Fiona had become distant and cold, that she had stopped loving him somewhere along the way. Fiona had told her mother a different story, one involving Trevor's jealousy and controlling behavior. His constant suspicions that she was having affairs with customers at the pharmacy, with the mailman, with anyone who looked at her twice. After the divorce, Fiona had thrown herself into rebuilding her life with quiet determination. She moved into the Oaks Avenue flat, furnished it with second-hand furniture from the Salvation Army shop in DY, and established a routine that rarely varied. She worked Monday through Friday, 9 to 5:30, stopped at the Woolworths on the way home to buy her dinner most nights, and spent her evenings watching television or reading. Her weekends were slightly more social. She would sometimes meet Estelle for coffee on Saturday mornings, or visit her mother in Chatswood, taking the bus because she couldn't afford to run her aging Toyota Corolla more than necessary. The car, a 1984 model with rust eating through the door panels and a temperamental engine, was her only major asset, besides her furniture and her small savings account that held just over $3,000. 6 months before her death, Fiona's life had taken a turn that felt, to those who knew her, like a fresh start. She had met Dominic Valente at the Stein Hotel in Manly on a Friday evening in April. Estelle had convinced her to come out for drinks after work, something Fiona rarely did. Dominic had been at the bar with a group of construction workers, loud and jovial after finishing a job in Fairlight. He was 39 years old, with the build of a man who worked with his hands, broad shoulders, muscular arms, a thick neck that strained against his collar. His hair was dark and wavy, styled with too much gel, and he had the kind of easy charm that came from years of talking his way into and out of situations. They had struck up a conversation when Dominic offered to buy Fiona and Estelle a round of drinks. Estelle had declined and left early, but Fiona stayed. She told her mother later that there was something magnetic about Dominic, something that made her feel alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. He was different from Trevor, she said. More spontaneous, more affectionate, less concerned with what the neighbors thought or whether the lawn was mowed. Within weeks, they were seeing each other regularly. Dominic would pick Fiona up after work in his white Ford Ute, the company name, Valente & Sons Construction, painted on the side in red letters. They would drive to Manly or DY, have dinner at cheap restaurants, walk along the beach. Fiona seemed happier than she had been in years. But there were aspects of Dominic's life that Fiona found frustrating, details that didn't quite add up. He was often unavailable on weekends, claiming he had to visit his elderly mother in Newcastle or handle business matters for the construction company. He never invited Fiona to his flat in Manly, always insisting they meet elsewhere or spend time at her place. When she pressed him about why she couldn't see where he lived, he would brush off her concerns with jokes or change the subject. He was private about his past, vague about his family beyond mentions of his mother and his business partner. Fiona confided in Estelle that sometimes she wondered if Dominic was hiding something, but she dismissed her own doubts. She wanted this relationship to work. She was tired of being alone. Chapter 2. The investigation begins. Senior Constable Raymond Birchall stood in the cramped office at Manly Police Station, staring at the photographs spread across his desk. The images showed Fiona Westbrook's body from every conceivable angle, close-ups of her face, her hands, the bruising around her neck, the sand patterns surrounding her. The forensic pathologist's preliminary report lay beside them, typed on official letterhead with clinical precision. Cause of death, asphyxiation due to manual strangulation. Time of death, approximately between 8 p.m. and midnight on October 14, 1991. The report noted petechial hemorrhaging in the eyes, crushed cartilage in the larynx, and defensive wounds on the victim's hands, scratches and broken fingernails consistent with fighting against an attacker. Birchall rubbed his eyes, feeling the familiar burn of too little sleep and too much coffee. He had been working this case for 72 hours straight, going home only to shower and change clothes before returning to the station. His wife Maureen had given up complaining about his hours years ago, but he could hear the resignation in her voice when he called to say he wouldn't be home for dinner again. Constable Gillian Moresby sat across from him, reviewing witness statements with the same methodical attention she brought to every task. She was 28 years old, relatively new to detective work, but sharp as a tack. Birchall had specifically requested her for this investigation because she had an eye for details that others missed. The investigation had moved quickly in the first 48 hours, following standard procedure for homicide cases. Fiona's identity had been confirmed through her fingerprints, which were on file from her pharmacy licensing. Her employer had been contacted, her flat searched, her bank records pulled. The timeline of her last day alive had been established through interviews with co-workers and review of the pharmacy's records. Fiona had worked a normal shift on October 14th, arriving at 9 a.m. and leaving at 5:30 p.m. According to Estelle Drummond, Fiona had seemed her usual self that day, perhaps a bit distracted, but not unusually so. She had mentioned that Dominic was expecting her at his flat that evening and that she was looking forward to seeing him. The pharmacy's security camera, a low-quality system that recorded over itself every 72 hours, showed Fiona leaving through the front door at 5:33 p.m., carrying her handbag and a small plastic shopping bag. She walked north on Pittwater Road, presumably toward where her car was parked, in the public lot behind the council offices. That was the last confirmed sighting of Fiona Westbrook alive. Her car, the rusty Toyota Corolla, had been found the following morning in the parking area near Manly Wharf, about 3 kilometers from where her body was discovered. The driver's side door was unlocked, keys still in the ignition. Her handbag was on the passenger seat, wallet still inside with $37 in cash, and her credit cards untouched. There was no sign of struggle in or around the vehicle. Birchall had immediately identified 2 primary suspects, both men who had been intimately involved in Fiona's life. The first was Trevor Westbrook, the ex-husband. Domestic violence and homicides committed by former intimate partners were depressingly common in Birchall's experience. The second was Dominic Valente, the current boyfriend and the last person who had expected to see Fiona on the night she disappeared. Both men had been brought in for formal interviews within 24 hours of the body's discovery. Both had provided alibis. Neither had seemed particularly convincing to Birchall, though he had learned long ago that gut feelings weren't evidence that would hold up in court. The physical evidence from the crime scene was frustratingly sparse. The beach environment had compromised much of what might have been useful. Sand, seawater, and wind had contaminated the scene. Footprints were impossible to distinguish in the churned-up sand around the body. The forensic team had collected samples from under Fiona's fingernails, where the defensive wounds suggested she had scratched her attacker. They had also collected fibers from her clothing and samples of sand and organic material from various locations around the body. But in 1991, DNA analysis was still in its relative infancy in Australia. The samples would be tested, but the process was slow and the results often inconclusive. Birchall knew he would need more than forensics to solve this case. He would need a confession, a witness, or a mistake by the killer. Chapter 3. The ex-husband Trevor. Westbrook sat in the interview room at Manly Police Station with the defensive posture of a man who had been wrongly accused before and expected to be wrongly accused again. He was 36 years old but looked older, with deep lines carved into his forehead and around his mouth, the kind of weathering that came from years of physical labor and stress. His hands, resting on the scarred wooden table, were permanently stained with engine oil no amount of scrubbing could remove. He wore blue work overalls, with his name embroidered over the left breast pocket, and he kept his eyes fixed on Birchall with a mixture of defiance and wariness. "I already told your constable everything," Trevor said before Birchall had even asked his first question. "I was at the garage Monday night. working on a rebuild for a customer. I didn't see Fiona, didn't talk to Fiona, didn't have anything to do with what happened to her. And before you start with the ex-husband, always does it routine. You should know that Fiona and I haven't been in contact for over a year. The divorce is done, I've moved on, she'd moved on. That's the end of it. Birchall leaned back in his chair and let the silence stretch for a moment before responding. He had interviewed hundreds of suspects over his career and learned that silence often provoked people into saying more than they intended. Trevor shifted in his seat but didn't speak again. Finally, Birchall said, "You'll understand that we have to verify everything, Trevor. A woman has been murdered. Your ex-wife. These are routine questions. I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm just trying to establish the facts." Trevor's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Right, facts. The facts are I was at Westbrook Motors from about 6 p.m. Monday until past midnight. I was rebuilding an engine for a Holden Commodore, a VL model, complete teardown and rebuild. My current wife, Pauline, brought me dinner around 7:30. She can verify I was there, so can my mate Ronnie Gillespie, who stopped by around 9 to drop off some parts I'd ordered. We had a beer together. He left around 9:30. I worked until after midnight, then went home. Pauline was already asleep when I got in." Birchall made notes, his pen scratching against the paper in the quiet room. "Tell me about your marriage to Fiona. Why did it end?" Trevor's expression darkened. "It ended because she was having an affair. Or at least I thought she was. I was probably wrong about that, if I'm being honest now. But at the time I was convinced. She was always working late, always had excuses for where she'd been. I let it get to me, let it make me paranoid. We fought about it constantly. Eventually she'd had enough of my accusations, and she left. Filed for divorce. I didn't contest it. What was the point? If she wanted out, she wanted out. Did you ever become physical with Fiona during these fights?" Birchall asked, watching Trevor's face carefully. "No, never. I'm not that kind of man," Trevor said firmly. I yelled, "Sure." I said things I regret. But I never laid a hand on her. She would have told people if I had. Her mother would have known. "Ask Beverly if you don't believe me. What about after the divorce?" "Did you have any contact with Fiona?" Trevor shook his head. "Not really. I saw her once or twice around DY just in passing. We didn't talk. What was there to say? I sent her a Christmas card last year, just to be civil. She didn't respond. I heard through mutual friends that she was seeing someone new. Good for her, I thought. I'd moved on too. I met Pauline at a wedding in early 1990, married her last December. We are happy. I had no reason to want Fiona dead." Birchall interviewed Pauline Westbrook separately. She was a heavy-set woman in her early 30s, with curly blonde hair and a nervous disposition. She confirmed that Trevor had been at the garage on Monday night, that she had brought him a meat pie and chips for dinner around 7:30. He was covered in grease, working on that engine, she said. He barely looked up when I came in. I stayed for maybe 10 minutes, then went home. Trevor's always working late. It's just how he is. He takes pride in his work. She seemed genuinely distressed by the situation, worried about how the police attention would affect their new marriage. The alibi checked out when Birchall interviewed Ronnie Gillespie, a parts supplier who confirmed stopping by the garage around 9 p.m. Monday. "Trevor was definitely there," Ronnie said. "We had a beer, talked about the footy for a bit. He was working on a Commodore engine exactly like he said. I left around 9:30, maybe a quarter to 10. He was still working when I left." Birchall also verified that the garage's neighbours, a printing business and a tile shop, had both been closed Monday evening, but that the garage's lights had been on late, visible from the street. Security footage from a nearby petrol station showed Trevor's distinctive yellow Tirana, leaving the industrial estate around 12:20 a.m. Tuesday morning. Despite the solid alibi, Birchall wasn't ready to completely eliminate Trevor as a suspect. People could be wrong about times, could coordinate stories, could lie to protect someone they loved. But as the investigation continued, Trevor Westbrook seemed increasingly unlikely as the killer. His emotional responses felt genuine, his alibi was corroborated by multiple independent sources, and he had no obvious motive beyond the generic suspicion that always fell on ex-husbands. Birchall moved him down the list of priorities and focused his attention on the boyfriend, Dominic Valente. Chapter 4. The boyfriend Dominic Valente presented an entirely different profile from Trevor Westbrook. Where Trevor had been defensive and angry, Dominic was cooperative and emotional. He had come to the police station voluntarily as soon as he heard about Fiona's death, arriving in his work clothes with red eyes and a tremor in his hands that could have been grief or could have been nerves. He sat in the same interview room where Trevor had been questioned 2 days earlier, and when Birchall entered, Dominic immediately broke down crying. "I don't understand," he said, his voice breaking. "I don't understand who would do this. She was supposed to come to my place Monday night. We were going to have dinner together. She never showed up. I called and called, but she didn't answer. I thought maybe she was angry with me about something, or maybe she'd just changed her mind. But this is insane." Birchall waited for Dominic to compose himself before beginning the formal interview. "Tell me about your relationship with Fiona. How long had you been seeing each other?" 6 months, give or take. We met in April at the Steen Hotel. I bought her a drink, we got talking. She was different from other women I'd known. Quieter, more thoughtful. She'd been hurt before by her ex-husband. I wanted to show her that not all men were like that. We started seeing each other regularly. A couple times a week at first, then more often. She made me happy. I thought I made her happy too. Where were you Monday evening between 6 and midnight? Birchall asked, his pen poised over his notebook. I was at my flat in Manly, Dominic said. I'd finished work around 5, went home, had a shower, started making dinner. Fiona was supposed to come over around 7. I made pasta, her favorite. When she didn't show by 7:30, I started calling her. I tried her home number maybe 6 or 7 times. No answer. I thought about driving to her place, but I didn't want to seem like I was checking up on her. She valued her independence, so I waited. I kept calling. Eventually, I ate the pasta by myself and fell asleep on the couch with the TV on. I woke up around midnight, tried calling once more, then went to bed. Birchall made detailed notes. Did anyone see you Monday evening? Did you speak to anyone besides attempting to reach Fiona? Dominic thought for a moment. My neighbor might have heard me. The walls in my building are thin. Mrs. Kowalski lives in the flat next door. She's always complaining about noise. She might have heard the phone ringing or me walking around. But I didn't actually see anyone or talk to anyone that night. Tell me about your flat. What's the address? Dominic provided an address on Belgrave Street in Manly, a 3-story building with 6 flats. Birchall made a note to verify this information and interview the neighbor. He then shifted his line of questioning. Did Fiona ever mention being worried about anything? Anyone following her? Any problems at work? Any conflicts with anyone? No, nothing like that. She lived a pretty quiet life. Work, home, spending time with me. Sometimes she'd visit her mother. She mentioned her ex-husband once or twice, said he'd been controlling during their marriage, but she didn't seem worried about him. She said that was all in the past. Birchall pulled out a photograph, a booking photo from 1987. Do you recognize this man? Dominic barely glanced at it before shaking his head. No, never seen him. Who is he? Just someone we're looking into, Birchall said neutrally, though this wasn't entirely true. The photo was of Leslie Thornbury, a man with a criminal record for assault who lived in Narrabeen. Birchall was testing Dominic's reaction, looking for any sign of recognition. There was none. The interview continued for another hour, with Birchall probing every aspect of Dominic's relationship with Fiona, his background, his movements on October 14th. Dominic's story remained consistent, and his emotional state seemed genuine. But Birchall's instincts told him something was off. It was nothing he could articulate precisely, just a feeling that Dominic was performing grief rather than experiencing it. The tears seemed too ready, the tremor in his hands too theatrical. Or perhaps Birchall was being cynical, seeing deception where there was only genuine trauma. The verification of Dominic's alibi proved more complicated than Trevor's had been. Mrs. Helena Kowalski, the 76-year-old Polish immigrant who lived next door to Dominic, confirmed that she had heard the phone ringing repeatedly Monday evening. I was trying to watch my program, she told Constable Moresby, and that phone kept ringing and ringing. 6 or 7 times, maybe more. I heard him walking around too, bumping into things. But I didn't see him. I don't leave my flat much these days. But when Moresby asked Mrs. Kowalski to describe Dominic, the old woman's description didn't quite match. She described him as thinner than Dominic actually was, and mentioned that he had a beard, which Dominic didn't. When pressed, Mrs. Kowalski admitted her eyesight wasn't what it used to be, and that she really only knew her neighbour by the sounds he made through the wall. This raised the possibility that someone else had been in Dominic's flat that night, making calls to Fiona's number to establish an alibi. Or it could simply be that an elderly woman with poor eyesight was confused about what her neighbour looked like. The more troubling discovery came when Burchell ran Dominic Valente's criminal history. There was a conviction from 1987, just as Dominic had mentioned. An assault charge stemming from a fight outside a pub in Brookvale. But the details were more serious than a simple bar fight. Dominic had beaten another man severely enough to put him in hospital for 3 days with broken ribs and a fractured jaw. The victim had been his girlfriend's ex-boyfriend, a man who Dominic claimed had been harassing her. The charges had been reduced to common assault as part of a plea deal, and Dominic had served 6 months in Silverwater Correctional Centre. It painted a picture of a man with a temper, someone capable of violence when threatened or challenged. Chapter 5. The Dead End. As October gave way to November and then December, the investigation into Fiona Westbrook's murder began to lose momentum. Burchell and his team had interviewed dozens of people. Fiona's co-workers at the pharmacy, her neighbours on Oaks Avenue, regular customers who might have interacted with her, friends from her past, distant relatives. They had investigated every lead, no matter how tenuous. A man who had been seen lurking near the pharmacy was tracked down and turned out to be a private investigator working on an unrelated insurance fraud case. A suspicious car reported near Manly Wharf on the night of October 14th belonged to a teenager who had been parked there with his girlfriend. None of it led anywhere useful. The forensic evidence remained stubbornly unhelpful. The DNA samples collected from under Fiona's fingernails had been sent to the State Forensic Laboratory. But the analysis was slow and the results, when they finally came back in early December, were inconclusive. The technology in 1991 could identify blood type and some basic genetic markers, but it wasn't sophisticated enough to provide a definitive match to a specific individual. The samples showed male DNA, which at least confirmed that Fiona had scratched her attacker and that her attacker was male. But without a suspect's DNA to compare it to, this information was of limited use. Burchell had requested samples from both Trevor and Dominic, and both had voluntarily provided them. Neither was conclusively excluded or included as a match based on the limited testing available. The investigation into other potential suspects also yielded nothing. Nigel Pemberton, a 31-year-old co-worker at the pharmacy who had made no secret of his attraction to Fiona, had seemed promising initially. Estelle had mentioned that Nigel was always finding excuses to talk to Fiona, offering to drive her home after work, inviting her to join him for lunch. But Nigel had an ironclad alibi for October 14th. He had been attending his parents' 40th wedding anniversary celebration at a restaurant in Pymble, surrounded by 20 family members from 6 p.m. until well past 11. Photographs from the event showed Nigel throughout the evening, smiling in group shots, caught in candid moments. There was no possible way he could have been in Manly or Narrabeen that night. The theory that Fiona had been the victim of a random attack by a stranger was explored thoroughly, but seemed increasingly unlikely. There had been no similar murders in the area, no pattern of attacks on women. Narrabeen Beach wasn't particularly isolated, even at night. There were usually a few people around, fishermen or teenagers drinking by the dunes. The fact that Fiona had been strangled rather than stabbed or bludgeoned suggested a personal crime, something intimate and rage-filled rather than opportunistic. Strangulation required the killer to be close to the victim, to look into her eyes as she died. That spoke of someone who knew her, someone who wanted her dead specifically. The media attention, which had been intense in the first 2 weeks after the body's discovery, gradually faded. The Sydney Morning Herald ran a follow-up story in late November with the headline, "Northern Beaches Murder Remains Unsolved." but it was buried on page 7 and contained no new information. The television news moved on to other crimes, other tragedies. Fiona Westbrook became another statistic, another unsolved homicide in the files of the New South Wales Police. Her mother Beverly called the station weekly, desperate for updates, and Birchall had to tell her again and again that there was nothing new to report. Each conversation left him feeling more impotent, more frustrated. Birchall became obsessed with the case in a way that worried his colleagues and his wife. He would stay late at the station, long after everyone else had gone home, spreading out the files and photographs, reviewing witness statements for the 100th time, searching for the detail he had missed, the connection he hadn't made. He created a massive chart on the wall of the incident room, with Fiona's photograph in the center and lines connecting her to every person in her life, every location relevant to the investigation. Trevor and Dominic had their own sections, with subcharts detailing their alibis, their histories, their potential motives, but nothing cohered into a clear narrative of what had happened that night. Maureen Birchall had grown accustomed to her husband's dedication over their 18 years of marriage. But this case was different. He wasn't just working late, he was haunted. She would wake in the middle of the night to find his side of the bed empty, and she would go downstairs to find him sitting in his study, with case files spread across his desk, staring at photographs of a dead woman he had never met while alive. "You're going to make yourself sick," she told him one night in January 1992. "You can't save her, Ray, she's gone. You did everything you could." But Birchall didn't feel like he had done everything. He felt like he had failed. He had interviewed the killer, he was certain of it. Either Trevor or Dominic had murdered Fiona Westbrook, and Birchall hadn't been able to prove it. One of them had looked him in the eye and lied, and Birchall had been unable to see through the deception. It ate at him, corroded his confidence in his own judgment. In March 1992, the case was officially designated as cold. Still open, still under investigation, but with no active leads being pursued. Birchall was assigned new cases, new murders, new victims who needed justice. But Fiona's file stayed on his desk, and he would pull it out whenever he had a spare moment, still searching for the truth. In 1993, Birchall was promoted and transferred to a different district. He took copies of Fiona's file with him, though officially he was supposed to leave everything with the Manly station. On his last day, he stood in the incident room and looked at the chart he had created, now dusty and faded. He took it down carefully, rolled it up and brought it home. It went into a filing cabinet in his study, along with his copies of the case files. Maureen didn't ask him why he couldn't let it go. She already knew the answer. Chapter 6. 16 years later, Yolanda Kristovich had been 8 years old in 1991, growing up in Melbourne and more concerned with her collection of garbage pail kids cards than with murders in Sydney. By 2007, she was a 38-year-old detective with the New South Wales Police Cold Case Unit, and Fiona Westbrook's murder was one of 37 unsolved homicides from the 1990s that had been flagged for review. The cold case program had been established 2 years earlier, driven by advances in DNA technology and a commitment to bringing closure to families who had spent decades without answers. Kristovich had volunteered for the unit, specifically because of her fascination with how new forensic methods could crack open cases that had seemed hopeless. She had a personal connection to cold cases that she rarely discussed with colleagues. When Kristovich was 14, her older sister Helena had disappeared while walking home from school in a Melbourne suburb. Helena's body had been found 3 weeks later in a stormwater drain. The killer had never been caught. The case remained unsolved, filed away in some dusty archive in Victoria. Yolanda had become a police officer, at least partly because of Helena, driven by a need to give other families the answers her own family had never received. The cold case unit felt like the right place for her, the place where she could do the most good. The Westbrook case caught her attention for several reasons. It had been professionally investigated at the time, with no obvious procedural failures. The lead detective, Raymond Birchall, had a reputation for thoroughness. 2 viable suspects had been identified, interviewed, and investigated, but neither could be conclusively linked to the crime. Most importantly, biological samples had been collected and preserved. In 2007, DNA technology had advanced far beyond what was available in 1991. Full genetic profiles could now be developed from tiny samples. Matches could be run through national databases that hadn't existed 16 years earlier. If Fiona's killer had committed any crime since 1991 that resulted in a DNA sample being taken, there was a chance of finding him now. Kristovich pulled the archived evidence boxes from storage in April 2007 and spread everything across her desk at the Cold Case Unit's offices in Parramatta. The physical evidence was stored in plastic evidence bags, each carefully labelled and sealed. Swabs from under Fiona's fingernails, fibres from her clothing, hair samples recovered from her body. All of it had been preserved according to protocol, kept in temperature-controlled storage. Kristovich submitted the samples to the forensic laboratory with a request for full DNA analysis using current technology. Then she began the process of reviewing the original investigation files. She spent weeks reading through everything: witness statements, interview transcripts, forensic reports, photographs, handwritten notes from Detective Birchall that showed his thought process. She created a digital timeline of October 14th, 1991, mapping out where every person of interest had been at every hour of the day. She researched what had happened to the key players in the 16 years since the murder. Trevor Westbrook had prospered, building his single garage into a chain of 3 automotive repair shops across the northern beaches. He was now 58 years old, still married to Pauline, well respected in the community. Dominic Valente had also done well for himself. His construction company had grown significantly, and he now employed 37 people. He was married to a woman named Siobhan and had 3 children aged 12, 10 and 7. Married? Kristovich frowned as she read through the background check on Dominic. That seemed odd. She checked the date of his marriage to Siobhan Valente, née Murphy. They had married on March 15th, 1984. 7 years before Fiona's murder. 7 years before Dominic had even met Fiona at the Stein Hotel. Kristovich sat back in her chair, her mind racing. Dominic Valente had been married when he was dating Fiona. Not only married, but married for 7 years. She flipped through the original investigation files, searching for any mention of this fact. Nothing. Either Detective Birchall hadn't discovered it, or Dominic had successfully hidden it during the investigation. Kristovich pulled up Siobhan Valente's details. She lived at an address in Charlestown, a suburb of Newcastle, about 2 hours north of Sydney. The property records showed that Dominic and Siobhan had purchased the house together in 1986. Kristovich checked Dominic's business records and found that while his construction company was based in Sydney, he had listed a Newcastle address as his primary residence in various documents from the early 1990s. The picture became clearer. Dominic had been living a double life. He maintained a flat in Manly for his work and his affairs, while his wife and family life were in Newcastle. Fiona had never known she was dating a married man. The DNA results came back from the laboratory in June 2007, and they changed everything. The samples from under Fiona's fingernails had yielded a complete male DNA profile. The profile was run through the National Criminal Database, which now contained genetic information from anyone who had been arrested or convicted of serious crimes across Australia since the mid-1990s. The computer flagged a match with a probability of 99.97%. The DNA belonged to Leslie Thornbury, a 52-year-old man currently living in Mount Druitt in Western Sydney. Kristovich pulled up Thornbury's criminal history on her computer screen and felt her pulse quicken. He had multiple convictions for assault spanning from 1983 to 2001. He had served 3 separate prison terms, the longest being 4 years for aggravated assault in 1998. His most recent conviction was in 2001 for assaulting a woman outside a pub in Penrith. He had been released from prison in 2004 and was currently on parole. His DNA had been collected as part of the routine sampling of convicted offenders, which was how it ended up in the database. But who was Leslie Thornbury, and what was his connection to Fiona Westbrook? Kristovich dug deeper into his background. In 1991, Thornbury had been 36 years old, living in a rental unit in Narrabeen. just blocks from where Fiona's body had been found. He had worked as a delivery driver for MedTech Supplies, a company that distributed medical equipment and supplies to pharmacies, clinics, and hospitals across Sydney. Kristovich felt a chill run down her spine. She pulled up the client list for MedTech Supplies from 1991 and found what she was looking for: DY Discount Chemist. Thornbury would have made regular deliveries to Fiona's workplace. He would have seen her, interacted with her, perhaps even developed an obsession with her. Within 48 hours, Kristovich had assembled a team and obtained an arrest warrant. On a grey Tuesday morning in early July 2007, 6 police officers arrived at the small brick house in Mount Druitt, where Leslie Thornbury lived alone. He answered the door in stained tracksuit pants and a singlet, a cigarette dangling from his lips, his eyes still puffy with sleep. When Kristovich identified herself and informed him that he was under arrest for the murder of Fiona Marjorie Westbrook, Thornbury's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, fear, resignation. He didn't protest or try to run. He simply nodded slowly, dropped his cigarette on the doorstep, and held out his wrists for the handcuffs. Chapter 7. The Breakthrough. The interview room at Parramatta Police Station was windowless and institutional, with pale green walls that seemed designed to induce a sense of hopelessness. Leslie Thornbury sat on one side of the metal table, his court-appointed lawyer beside him. A tired-looking woman in her 30s named Denise Kapoor, who had been assigned the case just 2 hours earlier. Across from them sat Yolanda Kristovich and her partner, Detective Senior Constable Marcus Flynn, a veteran investigator who had been with the cold case unit since its inception. Thornbury looked diminished in the harsh, fluorescent lighting. He was balding, with only a horseshoe of grey hair remaining around his skull. His face was weathered and lined, with broken capillaries across his nose and cheeks that suggested decades of heavy drinking. His hands resting on the table trembled slightly, not with nerves, Kristovich suspected, but from alcohol withdrawal. He looked like exactly what he was: a man whose life had been a series of bad decisions and worse impulses. A man who had spent more years inside prison than out over the past 2 decades. Kristovich began the interview by establishing the basic facts: Thornbury's name, address, employment history. Then she moved to October 1991. You lived in Narrabeen then, at a unit on Waterloo Street. Is that correct? Thornbury nodded. Yeah, dump of a place. I lived there for about 2 years. And you worked for MedTech Supplies as a delivery driver? Yeah. Until they sacked me in early '92 for showing up drunk. Did you make deliveries to DY Discount Chemist? Thornbury hesitated, glancing at his lawyer. She gave him a barely perceptible nod. Sometimes, yeah, it was on my route. I went to maybe a dozen different chemists around the northern beaches. Did you know Fiona Westbrook? Did you ever interact with her? Another hesitation, longer this time. I might have. There were a few people working there. I didn't know their names. I just dropped off boxes, got a signature, left. Kristovich slid a photograph across the table, a picture of Fiona taken a few months before her death. She was smiling at the camera, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. Do you recognize this woman? Thornbury barely glanced at it before shaking his head. No, I mean, she might have worked there, but I don't remember her specifically. It was 16 years ago. Kristovich let the silence stretch, watching Thornbury fidget. Then she said, We have your DNA, Les. We found it under Fiona's fingernails. She scratched her killer before she died, and we have your genetic material from those scratches. There's no question that you were there, that you had physical contact with her. The evidence is absolute. So let's stop pretending you don't remember her. Thornbury's face flushed red, and his hands clenched into fists. His lawyer put a hand on his arm, but he shook it off. He looked directly at Kristovich for the first time since the interview began. You don't understand, he said, his voice rising. You don't know what it was like. She led me on, made me think she wanted me. Then she laughed at me, rejected me like I was nothing. Tell me what happened, Kristovich said, keeping her voice calm and neutral. And so Thornbury told his version of events, a story that Kristovich immediately recognized as self-serving and incomplete. but which contained enough truth to be useful. He claimed that he had developed feelings for Fiona over the months he made deliveries to the pharmacy. She was always nice to him, he said, always smiled and asked how his day was going. He interpreted this basic courtesy as romantic interest. He had asked her out several times, and each time she had politely declined. This rejection festered in him, fed by alcohol and his own sense of inadequacy. On October 14, 1991, Thornbury said he had finished his deliveries early and decided to wait near Manly Wharf, where he knew Fiona sometimes parked when she visited her boyfriend in the area. He saw her arrive in her Toyota around 6:30 p.m. and approached her. He claimed he just wanted to talk to her, to try one more time to convince her to give him a chance. But Fiona had been frightened by his appearance, had told him to leave her alone or she would call the police. They argued. She slapped him. He grabbed her, he said, just trying to make her listen. Things escalated. Before he knew what was happening, his hands were around her throat. She fought him, scratched his face and arms, but he was stronger. When he realized she was dead, he panicked. He drove her body to Narrabeen Beach in his delivery van and buried her in the sand, hoping the tide would wash her out to sea. It was an accident, Thornbury insisted. I never meant to kill her. I just wanted her to listen to me, to give me a chance. She shouldn't have led me on like that. Kristovich felt disgust rise in her throat, but kept her expression neutral. That's interesting, Les, because what you're describing isn't what the forensic evidence shows. Fiona was strangled with sustained pressure for several minutes. That's not an accident. That's not grabbing someone in the heat of the moment. It's murder. Thornbury's lawyer intervened at this point, requesting a break to consult with her client. But Kristovich could see that Thornbury was close to cracking, close to telling her something more. She pushed forward. There's something you're not telling me, Les. Something about how you knew where Fiona would be that night. Something about how you knew she'd be alone near Manly Wharf. Because according to the original investigation, Fiona rarely went to that area. She was supposed to be at her boyfriend's flat in Manly, but that's a different location entirely. So how did you know where to find her? Thornbury's eyes darted around the room, looking anywhere but at Kristovich. His trembling had intensified. Finally, he said, I want a deal. I tell you everything. I want it in writing that my sentence will be reduced. I'm not taking the fall for this alone. This wasn't just me. Chapter 8. The Confrontation. The revelation that Leslie Thornbury hadn't acted alone sent shockwaves through the investigation. Kristovich immediately reported to her superior, Superintendent Graham Atkins, who authorized her to negotiate with the Director of Public Prosecutions about a potential plea deal. Within 72 hours, an agreement had been reached. If Thornbury provided truthful and complete testimony that led to the conviction of any accomplice or co-conspirator, his charge would be reduced from murder to manslaughter, with a maximum sentence of 18 years rather than life imprisonment. With his lawyer present and the deal formally signed, Thornbury told the full story. He had known Dominic Valente. They weren't close friends, but they had met through a mutual acquaintance in 1989 and had drunk together occasionally at various pubs around Manly and Brookvale. Dominic knew about Thornbury's interest in Fiona. Thornbury had mentioned her several times, complained about how she wouldn't give him the time of day. In late September 1991, Dominic had approached Thornbury with a proposal. He needed someone to take care of a problem, and he was willing to pay $15,000 for the service. The problem was Fiona Westbrook. According to Thornbury, Dominic never explicitly said he wanted Fiona killed. He used euphemisms, talked about needing her to disappear, said that she had become a complication in his life that needed to be resolved. But the implication was clear enough. Thornbury, who was perpetually broke and saw an opportunity to eliminate someone who had rejected him while making a substantial sum of money, agreed. They met twice more to discuss the details. Dominic provided information about Fiona's routines, her schedule, where she lived and worked. He told Thornbury that on October 14th, Fiona would be driving to his flat in Manly around 7 p.m., and that she would likely park near Manly Wharf, where parking was easier to find than on the narrow streets around his building. The plan, as Dominic laid it out, was for Thornbury to intercept Fiona before she reached the flat. He was supposed to tell her that Dominic had sent him, that there had been a change of plans. Dominic had even given Thornbury specific details to make the story convincing. He would say that Dominic's flat had flooded due to a burst pipe, and that Dominic was waiting at a friend's place nearby. Fiona, trusting that the message was legitimate, would go with Thornbury. Once they were away from witnesses, Thornbury was to kill her and dispose of the body. Dominic would have an alibi. He would be in his flat, making phone calls that could be verified. There would be nothing to connect him to Fiona's death. Thornbury had executed the plan exactly as instructed. He intercepted Fiona in the parking area near Manly Wharf, told her the story about the burst pipe. She had been hesitant at first, but when Thornbury mentioned details that only someone close to Dominic would know, his mother's name, the suburb where his business was based, she believed him. She got into Thornbury's white delivery van. He drove north toward Narrabeen, and somewhere along Pittwater Road, Fiona must have realized something was wrong. She demanded he stop the van, tried to open the door while they were moving. Thornbury pulled into a quiet side street, and that's when he attacked her. He strangled her in the front seat of the van, fighting against her desperate attempts to escape. Then he drove her body to Narrabeen Beach, a location he knew well from his morning surfing sessions, and buried her in the sand near the dunes. Dominic had paid him $7,500 immediately after the murder, meeting him in a car park in DY at 2 a.m. on October 15th. He promised the remaining half would come later, but Thornbury never received it. When he tried to contact Dominic in the following weeks, Dominic refused to meet with him, stopped answering his calls. Thornbury, trapped by his own complicity, couldn't go to the police without implicating himself in murder. So he took his $7,500, drank most of it away within a few months, and tried to forget what he'd done. The guilt and shame contributed to his spiral into worse violence, more crime, more prison time. Kristovich listened to all of this with growing fury, carefully controlled. Why didn't you tell anyone before now? Why let Fiona's family go 16 years without answers? Thornbury had the decency to look ashamed. I was scared. I thought if I came forward, I'd get life in prison, and Dominic would get away with it. He's got money, lawyers, connections. I'm nobody. Who are they going to believe? Armed with Thornbury's testimony, Kristovich immediately began verifying every detail that could be verified. She pulled phone records from 1991, still archived by Telstra despite the passage of time, and found exactly what she was looking for. On October 14th, 1991, 4 calls had been made from Dominic Valente's listed phone number to Fiona Westbrook's home phone. At 7:18 p.m., 7:47 p.m., 8:23 p.m., and 9:01 p.m. This matched what Dominic had told Detective Birchall in the original investigation. He claimed he'd been calling Fiona because she hadn't shown up as expected. But there were other calls in the phone records that hadn't been investigated in 1991. Between September 20th and October 13th, there had been 7 calls from Dominic's phone to another number. Kristovich traced that number and felt vindication wash over her. The number belonged to a payphone outside a fish and chip shop in Brookvale, 3 blocks from where Leslie Thornbury had lived. More damning evidence emerged when Kristovich began a deep investigation into Dominic's finances from 1991. Bank records showed that on September 22, 1991, Dominic had withdrawn $8,000 in cash from his business account. On October 17, 1991, he had withdrawn another $8,000. The withdrawals were unusual. Most of his business transactions were done by check, and his personal expenses were typically charged to a credit card. The timing was too coincidental. $8,000 just before the murder, $8,000 just after. Close enough to the $15,000 Thornbury claimed he'd been promised. The insurance policy that Kristovich discovered next should have been found during the original investigation, but somehow it had slipped through the cracks. In April 1991, the same month Dominic met Fiona, she had taken out a life insurance policy for $100,000 through her employment. The initial beneficiary listed was her mother, Beverly Westbrook. But on September 15, 1991, Fiona had changed the beneficiary to Dominic Valente. The paperwork for the change was signed by Fiona and included a notarized statement. Kristovich obtained a copy of the signature and compared it to known samples of Fiona's handwriting. The signature appeared genuine, which meant Fiona had willingly made Dominic her beneficiary. But Dominic had never mentioned this to police in 1991, and crucially, he had never filed a claim on the policy after Fiona's death. The pieces came together with devastating clarity. Dominic had convinced Fiona to make him the beneficiary of her life insurance policy, probably by talking about their future together, about eventually getting married. Then he had arranged for her murder. The $15,000 paid to Thornbury was an investment that would yield $100,000. But after the murder, with police investigating and suspicion potentially falling on him as the boyfriend, Dominic must have decided that filing the insurance claim was too risky. It would have drawn immediate attention to him as someone with a financial motive. So he had walked away from the money, calculating that his freedom was worth more than $100,000. But there was still a crucial question. Why did Dominic want Fiona dead in the first place? The insurance money was a motive, certainly, but Kristovich sensed there was something more. She continued digging through records and found the answer in a document from Newcastle Hospital dated August 23, 1991. It was a receipt for medical services provided to Fiona. Marjorie Westbrook. Pregnancy confirmation test. The result was positive. Fiona had been pregnant in August 1991. She had been murdered in October 1991. Kristovich felt her stomach turn. She now understood the timeline completely. Fiona had discovered she was pregnant with Dominic's child. She had probably told him in late August or early September, expecting him to be happy, expecting that they would build a life together. But Dominic already had a life, a wife and family in Newcastle that Fiona knew nothing about. A baby would expose his double life, would destroy his marriage, might cost him his business if the scandal became public. So he had made a terrible calculation. He convinced Fiona to change her insurance beneficiary, making her believe they had a future. Then he arranged for her murder, eliminating the threat she posed to his carefully compartmentalized life. On July 18, 2007, Detective Yolanda Kristovich and a team of 6 officers arrived at the headquarters of Valente & Sons Construction in Brookvale. Dominic Valente was in a meeting with several foremen discussing a project in Chatswood. He looked up in surprise when the police entered, confusion crossing his face. Then he saw Kristovich's expression, and his face went pale. He knew. Somehow he knew why they were there. When Kristovich told him he was under arrest for the murder of Fiona Westbrook, Dominic didn't say a word. He simply stood up, removed his watch and his wedding ring, placed them on the conference table, and allowed himself to be handcuffed. His employees watched in stunned silence as he was led away. Chapter 9. The twisted truth emerges. The interrogation of Dominic Valente was nothing like the interview with Leslie Thornbury. Where Thornbury had been nervous and quick to confess once confronted with evidence, Dominic was calm and calculating. He sat in the interview room at Parramatta Police Station with his lawyer, an expensive criminal defense attorney, named Marcus Reeves, who had been retained within 2 hours of Dominic's arrest and said almost nothing. When Kristovich laid out the evidence, piece by piece, Dominic's expression never changed. He stared at a point on the wall above her head, his face a mask of indifference. Kristovich presented the phone records showing calls to the payphone near Thornbury's address. She presented the bank records showing the cash withdrawals. She presented the insurance policy with Dominic listed as beneficiary. She presented the hospital records showing Fiona's pregnancy. She explained that Thornbury had confessed to everything and was prepared to testify against Dominic in court. Through it all, Dominic said nothing, and his lawyer advised him to continue saying nothing. It was a smart strategy, Kristovich had to admit. Without Dominic's confession, the prosecution's case would rely heavily on Thornbury's testimony. And a defense attorney could easily argue that Thornbury was lying to reduce his own sentence, that the circumstantial evidence could have innocent explanations. But Kristovich had one more card to play. She had requested permission to interview Siobhan Valente, Dominic's wife, and Superintendent Atkins had granted it. On July 20th, Kristovich and Detective Flynn drove to Charlestown and knocked on the door of the neat brick house where Siobhan had lived for over 20 years. She answered the door looking exhausted, her eyes red from crying. She had heard about Dominic's arrest from his lawyer and had spent the past 2 days in shock, trying to explain to her children why their father was in jail. Siobhan invited the detectives inside and made tea with trembling hands. She was 53 years old, a former nurse who now worked part-time at a medical clinic. She had short grey hair and the worn appearance of someone who had carried heavy burdens for a long time. When Kristovich explained what they believed Dominic had done, Siobhan didn't seem surprised. She just nodded slowly, as if confirming something she had always suspected but never allowed herself to fully acknowledge. "I knew he was unfaithful," Siobhan said quietly. "I knew there were other women over the years. He would disappear for days at a time, claim it was work. I found evidence a few times, receipts, phone numbers, once a piece of jewelry that wasn't for me. We had terrible fights about it. But we had children, and I loved him, so I stayed. I told myself it was just affairs, that he would eventually grow out of it. I never imagined." She broke down then, sobbing into her hands. Kristovich waited patiently. When Siobhan had composed herself, Kristovich asked the crucial questions. "Do you remember where Dominic was on October 14th, 1991? Siobhan thought for a long moment. "That was 16 years ago. I can't possibly remember a specific day. It was a Monday." "Would Dominic typically have been home on Monday evenings in 1991? Siobhan shook her head. He was usually in Sydney Monday through Friday, working on construction projects. He came home most weekends, but sometimes he would stay in Sydney if there was a job that needed finishing." "October 1991, she paused, thinking. "That was before our youngest was born. I would have been pregnant. Dominic was in Sydney a lot during that period. He said the business was growing, and he needed to be there to manage it." "Did you know Fiona Westbrook? Had you ever heard Dominic mention her name?" "No, never." Siobhan's voice was barely a whisper now. She looked up at Kristovich with haunted eyes. "Was she pregnant? Is that why he killed her?" Kristovich nodded. "Yes. We believe Fiona told Dominic she was pregnant and expected him to support her, perhaps marry her. She didn't know about you, didn't know he was already married with children. When she became pregnant, she became a threat to his double life. So he arranged for her death." Siobhan closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face. Oh God, that poor woman. Those poor families. And my children. How do I tell my children their father is a murderer?" The interview with Siobhan provided context, but not evidence that would be admissible in court. However, Kristovich's next discovery was evidential gold. She had been reviewing the original police files again, looking at everything through the new lens of what she now knew, when she found something that Detective Birchall had noted but apparently hadn't fully investigated. During the initial search of Fiona's flat in October 1991, officers had collected various papers and documents, including a notebook Fiona used as a diary. The entries were sporadic and brief, mostly reminders about appointments or shopping lists. But there was one entry from September 12, 1991, that now seemed crucial. The entry read, "D called. Upset about something, wouldn't say what. Talked about future, asked about insurance through work. And told him I had policy, 100K, Mum is beneficiary. He suggested I should change it if we're serious about each other, thinking about marriage. Makes sense, I suppose. We'll look into it." 3 days later, on September 15th, Fiona had changed her insurance beneficiary to Dominic. The diary entry proved that Dominic had initiated the conversation about the insurance policy, that he had specifically suggested Fiona change her beneficiary. Combined with everything else, it painted a picture of premeditation and manipulation. Dominic had planted the seed, waited for Fiona to act on it, and then set his plan in motion. Kristovich brought this new evidence to the Director of Public Prosecutions, along with everything else they had compiled. The DPP agreed that while the case was largely circumstantial, the weight of the evidence was overwhelming. With Thornbury's testimony, the phone records, the financial records, the insurance policy, and the diary entry, a jury would likely convict. the decision was made to proceed with charges of murder for hire and conspiracy to commit murder. When confronted with the diary entry, Dominic's composure finally cracked. His lawyer requested a private consultation, and when they emerged an hour later, Dominic had agreed to make a statement. But his statement wasn't a confession, at least not in the way Kristovich had hoped. Dominic admitted that he had been having an affair with Fiona, that he had been married the entire time. He admitted that Fiona had told him she was pregnant and that he had panicked. He admitted suggesting she change her insurance beneficiary and that he had made the cash withdrawals in September and October 1991. But he claimed he had given that money to Fiona, helping her with expenses because she was pregnant with his child. He vehemently denied ever speaking to Leslie Thornbury about killing Fiona. He claimed Thornbury must have been obsessed with Fiona, must have killed her on his own, and was now lying about Dominic's involvement to reduce his own sentence. It was a calculated defense, plausible enough to create reasonable doubt in the mind of at least some jurors. Dominic was essentially admitting to being a terrible person, a cheat, a liar, someone who abandoned a pregnant woman, while denying being a murderer. His lawyer would argue that the phone calls to the payphone near Thornbury's address were coincidental, that Dominic had called that particular phone to reach someone else entirely. They would argue that the insurance policy showed Dominic had no motive to kill Fiona. If he had wanted the insurance money, why hadn't he claimed it after her death? They would paint Thornbury as the real killer, a violent criminal with multiple assault convictions who had developed an obsession with Fiona and murdered her when she rejected him. Kristovich knew it would be a difficult case to prosecute, but she also knew they had to try. The evidence was there. The truth was clear, even if proving it beyond reasonable doubt would be a challenge. The case went to trial in September 2008, nearly a year after Dominic's arrest and 17 years after Fiona Westbrook's murder on Narrabeen Beach. Chapter 10. The Trial. The Supreme Court of New South Wales in Darlinghurst was packed on the first day of trial. The case had generated enormous media attention. A murder for hire solved after 17 years through DNA technology and cold case detective work. The gallery was filled with journalists, members of the public who had followed the case, and the families of both the victim and the accused. Beverly Westbrook, now 78 years old and using a walker, sat in the front row with her sister. Siobhan Valente sat on the opposite side of the courtroom, her face carefully neutral, 2 of her 3 adult children beside her. The oldest son had refused to attend, unable to face the reality of what his father had done. The prosecution was led by Crown Prosecutor Helena Fitzpatrick, a formidable woman in her 50s with a reputation for meticulous preparation and devastating cross-examinations. The defense team was led by Marcus Reeves, equally skilled and known for his ability to create reasonable doubt even in seemingly airtight cases. Justice Margaret Thornhill presided, a stern but fair judge who ran her courtroom with strict efficiency. The prosecution's case unfolded over 3 weeks. Fitzpatrick methodically presented the evidence, building layer upon layer to show that Dominic Valente had carefully planned Fiona Westbrook's murder and hired Leslie Thornbury to execute it. She called witnesses who testified about Fiona's relationship with Dominic, about her excitement in the months before her death, about how she had believed they had a future together. Isdell Drummond, now 51 and still working at the pharmacy, broke down on the stand as she described Fiona's happiness in the weeks before her death. How she had been planning to tell Dominic about the pregnancy at just the right moment. The forensic evidence was presented by Dr. Patricia Wu, the forensic scientist who had analyzed the DNA samples in 2007. She explained in clear, simple terms how DNA analysis worked, how the samples from under Fiona's fingernails had been preserved for 16 years, and how those samples definitively matched Leslie Thornbury's genetic profile. There was no doubt, she testified, that Thornbury had been in physical contact with Fiona at the time of her death, and that she had fought against him. Then came Leslie Thornbury's testimony, the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. Thornbury had cleaned up for his court appearance, wearing an ill-fitting suit and with his hair neatly combed. But he still looked like what he was, A criminal, someone who had spent years in prison, someone with violence etched into his features. Fitzpatrick led him through his testimony carefully, establishing his background, his connection to Fiona through his delivery work, and his admission that he had killed her. Thornbury described his meetings with Dominic in detail, where they occurred, what was said, how the plan was formulated. He testified about the $15,000 payment, about how Dominic had provided information to help him intercept Fiona, about the actual murder itself. The cross-examination by Marcus Reeves was brutal. He attacked Thornbury's credibility from every angle, pointing out his criminal history, his history of violence against women, his alcohol abuse. "You're a convicted violent offender, aren't you, Mr. Thornbury?" Reeves asked. "You've been arrested how many times?" 7, 8. "You've assaulted women before, haven't you? And now you expect this jury to believe that you're telling the truth, that you're not just lying to reduce your own sentence." Thornbury held up better than Kristovich had expected. He admitted his past crimes, admitted he was a bad person who had done terrible things, but he insisted that he was telling the truth about Dominic. "I've got nothing to gain by lying now," he said. "I've already admitted to killing Fiona. I'm going to prison no matter what. But I'm not going to let him get away with ordering it. He paid me to do it. That's the truth." The phone records and financial records were presented next, with expert witnesses explaining the pattern of calls to the payphone near Thornbury's residence and the unusual cash withdrawals from Dominic's accounts. A telecommunications specialist testified that the calls from Dominic's phone to the Brookvale payphone lasted between 3 and 7 minutes. Too long to be wrong numbers. Clearly purposeful conversations. A forensic accountant testified that the cash withdrawals were inconsistent with Dominic's normal spending patterns and that there was no record of what the $16,000 had been used for. The insurance policy and Fiona's diary entry were perhaps the most damning pieces of evidence. The insurance agent who had processed Fiona's beneficiary change testified that Fiona had seemed happy when she made the change, that she had mentioned planning for her future with her boyfriend. The diary entry was read aloud in court, decalled. Upset about something, wouldn't say what. Talked about future, asked about insurance through work. The implication was clear. Dominic had manipulated Fiona into changing her beneficiary as part of his plan. Beverly Westbrook gave a victim impact statement that left many in the courtroom in tears. She described the 17 years of not knowing, of suspecting everyone, of seeing her daughter's murder go unsolved while life went on around her. She described how she had suspected Trevor initially, how guilty she felt about that now. She described the phone calls she made to the police every few months, begging for updates, praying for justice. "And I want Dominic Valente to know," she said, her voice shaking with emotion, "that he didn't just kill my daughter. He killed part of me too. He killed my hope, my faith in people, my ability to trust. He took Fiona from this world before she could even hold her baby, and he's shown no remorse, no acknowledgement of what he's done. I hope he spends the rest of his life in prison, thinking about what he took from us." The defense case was shorter but focused. Reeves called character witnesses who testified that Dominic was a good employer, a respected member of the business community, someone who had built a successful company through hard work. He called Dominic's business partner, who testified that the cash withdrawals were for under-the-table payments to contractors, a common practice in the construction industry in the early 1990s. He presented phone records showing that Dominic had also made calls to several other payphones around Sydney during that period, arguing that the calls to the Brookvale payphone weren't unusual or significant. Most significantly, Reeves hammered away at the fact that Dominic had never claimed the insurance money after Fiona's death. Why would someone arrange a murder to collect insurance money and then not collect it? He asked the jury during his closing argument. It makes no sense. The prosecution wants you to believe that Dominic is some criminal mastermind who carefully planned this murder, but also that he was stupid enough to leave evidence everywhere and then not even collect the money he supposedly killed for. The truth is much simpler. Leslie Thornbury, a violent criminal with a history of assaulting women, became obsessed with Fiona Westbrook. When she rejected him, he killed her. And now he's lying about my client's involvement to save himself from a life sentence. Don't let a career criminal manipulate you into convicting an innocent man. Dominic Valente himself took the stand in his own defense, a risky move that Reeves had apparently calculated was necessary. Dominic presented a carefully crafted version of himself, remorseful about his affair, ashamed of his deception, but adamant about his innocence regarding Fiona's murder. Yes, he admitted, he had been living a double life. Yes, he had lied to Fiona about being single. Yes, when she told him she was pregnant, he had panicked and behaved shamefully. He had offered her money, tried to convince her to terminate the pregnancy, said terrible things he now regretted. But he had never ever considered having her killed. I was a coward, Dominic testified, his voice breaking at strategic moments. I was selfish and cruel. When Fiona told me she was pregnant, I should have told her the truth about my marriage, faced the consequences, done the right thing. Instead, I ran from my responsibilities. I gave her money and then avoided her calls. I'm ashamed of that. I've had 17 years to think about how badly I failed her. But I didn't kill her. I would never have hurt her that way. I cared about Fiona. She deserved so much better than what I gave her, but I didn't have her murdered. Fitzpatrick's cross-examination was withering. She walked Dominic through every lie he had told, to Fiona, to his wife, to the police in 1991, to the court now. She confronted him with the phone calls to the payphone, and Dominic claimed he had been calling a bookie he occasionally used for illegal sports betting, a claim that was conveniently impossible to verify 17 years later. She asked him about the insurance policy, and Dominic stuck to his story that Fiona had voluntarily changed the beneficiary because they were planning a future together. She asked why he hadn't claimed the money after Fiona's death, and Dominic said it would have felt like profiting from tragedy, that he couldn't bring himself to do it. But Fitzpatrick's most effective line of questioning centered on the timeline of the pregnancy. She established that Fiona had discovered she was pregnant in late August 1991. Within 2 weeks, Dominic had convinced her to change her insurance beneficiary. Within a month, she was dead. The phone calls to Thornbury's payphone had all occurred during that same month. The cash withdrawals had occurred during that same month. You expect this jury to believe that's all coincidence? Fitzpatrick asked. That at the exact moment Fiona's pregnancy became a threat to your marriage, your business, your entire double life, she just happened to be murdered by someone else? Someone you happened to know? Someone you happened to be calling regularly from payphones? Dominic maintained his composure, insisting it was all coincidence, that he had been unlucky. But Kristovich, watching from the gallery, could see the jury's expressions. They didn't believe him. The weight of the circumstantial evidence was too much. Even if each individual piece could theoretically have an innocent explanation, taken together, they told a story that was impossible to deny. The trial lasted 5 weeks. The jury deliberated for 3 days. During that time, Kristovich stayed at the courthouse, unable to focus on anything else. She had worked this case for over a year, had devoted countless hours to understanding Fiona Westbrook's life and death, and now everything came down to 12 strangers in a deliberation room. On the 3rd day, word came that the jury had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled quickly, everyone sensing that the wait was over. Chapter 11. Justice and Aftermath. The jury foreman was a middle-aged man in a business suit who looked exhausted from 3 days of deliberation. He stood when Justice Thornhill asked if they had reached a verdict, and his voice was steady as he said they had. The courtroom fell into absolute silence, the kind of profound quiet where every breath seems loud, every movement significant. Kristovich found herself holding her breath, her hands clenched in her lap so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Beside her, Detective Flynn sat with his eyes fixed on the jury foreman, his expression unreadable. Justice Thornhill addressed the foreman with formal precision. On the charge of murder for hire, how do you find the defendant, Dominic Anthony Valente? Guilty, the foreman said, and the courtroom erupted. There were gasps and sobs, shouts and crying. Beverly Westbrook collapsed against her sister, weeping with relief and grief intertwined. Siobhan Valente sat frozen, her face drained of all color, while her daughter beside her covered her face with her hands. Journalists scrambled to exit the courtroom, racing to file their stories. Justice Thornhill hammered her gavel repeatedly, calling for order, threatening to clear the courtroom if people couldn't control themselves. Dominic Valente's face remained impassive, but Kristovich saw his hands trembling as the bailiff approached to lead him away. He glanced back once at his wife and children, and in that moment something in his expression cracked. Not remorse exactly, but perhaps recognition of everything he had destroyed. Then he was gone, led through the side door to the holding cells below the courthouse. The sentencing hearing took place 3 weeks later, in October 2008. The Crown sought a life sentence with a minimum non-parole period of 25 years. The defense argued for a lesser sentence, citing Dominic's lack of a prior criminal record. His contributions to the community, the fact that he hadn't personally carried out the killing. Justice Thornhill listened to both sides, reviewed the pre-sentence reports, and then delivered her judgment. This was a calculated, premeditated murder carried out for the most venal of reasons. Justice Thornhill said, her voice ringing with controlled anger. The defendant exploited a vulnerable woman's affection for him, manipulated her into making him the beneficiary of her life insurance, and then arranged for her death to eliminate what he viewed as an inconvenient problem. Fiona Westbrook was pregnant with the defendant's child when she died. She believed she had a future with him. Instead, he condemned her to a terrifying death at the hands of a violent stranger. The defendant has shown no genuine remorse, only self-pity at being caught. The impact of his crime has devastated multiple families and left a community without answers for 17 years. Justice Thornhill sentenced Dominic Valente to life imprisonment, with a minimum non-parole period of 25 years. He would be eligible for parole in 2032 when he would be 80 years old. Given his age and the length of the sentence, it was entirely possible he would die in prison. As the sentence was handed down, Dominic finally showed emotion, his face crumpling as he realized the full weight of what he had lost. His lawyer immediately filed notice of appeal, but few observers believed it would succeed. Leslie Thornbury's sentencing had taken place earlier, shortly after his testimony at Dominic's trial. True to the plea agreement, he was convicted of manslaughter rather than murder, and sentenced to 18 years imprisonment, with a minimum non-parole period of 12 years. He would be eligible for parole in 2019, when he would be 64 years old. At the sentencing hearing, Thornbury had made a statement apologizing to Fiona's family, though his words rang hollow to those who heard them. "Sorry doesn't bring her back," Beverly Westbrook had said to reporters afterward, but at least he told the truth about what happened. At least we finally know. The resolution of the case brought a measure of closure, but the aftermath rippled through many lives. Siobhan Valente filed for divorce within a month of Dominic's conviction. She sold the house in Charlestown, unable to live in a place that held so many memories of a life that had been built on lies. Her relationship with her children was strained. The two who had attended the trial struggled to reconcile their memories of their father with the monster he had been revealed to be. The oldest son, who had refused to attend, cut off all contact with Dominic and legally changed his surname, wanting nothing that connected him to his father. Trevor Westbrook attended the sentencing hearing, sitting quietly in the back row of the gallery. Afterward, he spoke briefly to reporters, his voice thick with emotion. "I spent years being suspected, having people look at me and wonder if I'd killed my ex-wife. My marriage to Pauline was nearly destroyed by the suspicion. I'm glad the truth is out. I'm glad Fiona's real killer is going to prison. But it doesn't undo the damage. It doesn't give me back those years of being treated like a murderer." He declined to say anything more, walking away with Pauline beside him, her hand clasped tightly in his. Yolanda Kristovich was commended for her work on the case and received a commissioner's commendation for courage and integrity. But the accolade meant less to her than the conversation she had with Beverly Westbrook after the sentencing. Beverly had asked to meet with Kristovich privately, and they sat together in a small cafe in Darlinghurst, drinking tea and talking about Fiona. Beverly showed Kristovich photographs of her daughter, Fiona, as a baby, as a schoolgirl, as a young woman on her wedding day. Smiling and hopeful, she told stories about Fiona's childhood, her dreams of becoming a pharmacist rather than just a technician, her love of reading and the ocean. She deserved so much more than she got, Beverly said quietly, her fingers tracing the edge of a photograph showing Fiona at the beach, sun in her hair. She deserved to have her baby, to find someone who would love her properly, to grow old. Instead, she got Dominic Valente, and he took everything from her. But at least now she can rest. At least now everyone knows what really happened. Kristovich thought about her own sister, Helena, whose murder remained unsolved after 24 years. She thought about all the other cold cases in the archives, all the other families waiting for answers that might never come, and she felt grateful that she had been able to give Beverly Westbrook what her own family had never received. The truth, injustice, and some measure of peace. Raymond Birchall, the original detective on the case, had followed the trial closely from his retirement home in the Blue Mountains. He was 69 years old now, his steel-grey hair turned white, his hands shaky from early-stage Parkinson's disease. When Kristovich called to tell him about the guilty verdict, she heard him break down crying on the other end of the line. "Thank you," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "Thank you for finishing what I started. I knew it was one of them. I knew Dominic was lying to me, but I couldn't prove it. You did it. You got justice for Fiona." Kristovich invited Birchall to attend the sentencing hearing, and he came, accompanied by his wife, Maureen. Afterward, Kristovich gave him copies of all the case files, the evidence that had finally cracked the case. Birchall held the folders like they were precious artifacts, which, in a way, they were. Proof that his instincts had been right, that his years of obsession hadn't been wasted. He had been a young detective when Fiona was murdered. Now he was an old man, but he had lived to see her killer brought to justice. That meant something. That meant everything. The case generated significant media attention and public discussion about DNA technology and cold case investigations. Several other jurisdictions in Australia announced new cold case review programs. Inspired by the success in solving Fiona Westbrook's murder, the New South Wales Police committed additional resources to their cold case unit. Recognizing that advances in forensic technology meant that many previously unsolvable cases could now be reopened and potentially solved, Kristovich became something of a public figure, giving interviews about the importance of never giving up on unsolved cases, about the power of modern forensics to deliver justice even decades after a crime. But for Kristovich, the real satisfaction came not from the publicity, but from the quiet moments. The thank you card from Beverly Westbrook, the email from one of Fiona's former co-workers expressing relief that the truth was finally known, the message from a woman in Queensland whose sister had been murdered in 1993, and whose family was encouraged by Fiona's case to push for a cold case review. These were the things that mattered, the real impact of the work. 3 months after Dominic's sentencing, Beverly Westbrook made a trip to Narrabeen Beach. It was a warm November morning, much like the morning Malcolm Hendry had discovered Fiona's body 17 years earlier. Beverly walked slowly across the sand, leaning on her walker, until she reached the approximate location where her daughter had been found. She stood there for a long time, looking out at the ocean, letting the wind whip her grey hair around her face. She had brought flowers, a bouquet of roses, Fiona's favourite. She placed them on the sand and spoke to her daughter, the words carried away by the wind but not unheard. "I wanted you to know," she said, "that we found out what happened. We found the man who did this to you, and he's going to spend the rest of his life in prison. I'm sorry it took so long. I'm sorry you had to wait 17 years for justice. But it came, sweetheart. Justice came." She stood there until the tide began to come in, until the water reached the flowers and began to pull them toward the sea. Then she turned and walked slowly back across the beach, back to the car park where her sister waited. She didn't look back. She had said what she needed to say. Fiona could rest now. They could all rest now. The truth had shocked everyone, not just because of what Dominic Valente had done, but because of how successfully he had hidden it for so long. He had been a respected businessman, a family man, someone who had fooled police in 1991, and continued fooling everyone for 16 years afterward. The case served as a reminder that monsters don't always look like monsters. that evil can wear a pleasant face and speak with a charming voice. Dominic Valente had been someone's husband, someone's father, someone's business partner. And he had also been a murderer. In the end, it was science that caught him. DNA technology that hadn't existed in any meaningful way in 1991, advanced enough by 2007 to identify Leslie Thornbury from a 17-year-old sample. And it was persistence. The determination of a cold case detective who believed that every unsolved murder deserved another look, that every victim deserved justice no matter how much time had passed. Yolanda Kristovich moved on to other cases, other cold files waiting to be reopened and investigated. But she never forgot Fiona Westbrook, never forgot the photograph of a smiling young woman who had believed she had found love and had instead found death. The 1991 murder case was solved in 2007, and the truth had indeed shocked everyone. But more than that, the truth had freed those who had been left behind, freed them from suspicion, from uncertainty, from the endless wondering that haunts the families of murder victims. Fiona Marjorie Westbrook could finally rest in peace, and those who loved her could finally begin to heal. Justice had taken 17 years, but it had arrived at last. And in the end, perhaps that was all that mattered. That the truth was known, that the guilty were punished, and that a young woman's death had not been forgotten. Even after all those years, even after the world had moved on. Fiona had mattered. Her life had mattered. Her death had mattered. And now, finally, everyone knew why she had died and who had stolen her future. The case was closed. The mystery was solved. And somewhere in Rookwood Cemetery, where Fiona Westbrook had been buried in October 1991, a gravestone stood with her name and dates carved into the granite. Below those dates, Beverly had recently added a new inscription. The truth finally known, justice served 2008.